12 years ago, my team isolated the pathogen in a field hospital outside Kinshasa in 72 hours. I remember thinking, not fast enough. There had been 200 deaths by the time we arrived, 200 families, 200 people who I spent 22 years as a field epidemiologist. I had been inside containment tents in 6 countries. I had worn the same biohazard suit until the seams degraded. I had eaten meals I didn't taste while writing reports that would be read in Geneva by people who had never seen what the reports described. I was 48 years old, and I was good at my job. The last thing I remember clearly is a highway in the rain. A call from the office about an emerging cluster in Southeast Asia that I had flagged 3 weeks earlier and been told was probably influenza, a truck that had crossed the center line. Not a dramatic death, not the kind that matches the life. Then nothing, then a smell, straw, wood smoke, animal fat burning somewhere close. Under that, something sweet and human and ancient. The smell of a place where fire is the only heat source and the walls don't breathe. I did not open my eyes immediately. I had learned in a career spent waking up in unfamiliar places to orient before acting. Assess first, move second. The surface under me was rough, not a mattress. Packed earth covered in straw from the texture of it. The air was cold at the edges, warm near my face. Someone had covered me with something heavy and animal-smelling. I opened my eyes. Low rafters, rough-cut timber, dark with smoke. A tallow candle on a shelf throwing orange light across walls of packed mud and wattle. A fire in a central pit, no chimney, the smoke going wherever it chose. A wooden table, a ceramic bowl, dried bundles of something hanging from the rafters. Lavender, rosemary. Things that smelled better than anything in this room currently smelled. I sat up. Wrong. The movement was wrong. Not the stiffness of sleep or injury, the architecture of it was wrong. The geometry of my own body performing a simple action in a way I didn't recognize. I held up a hand. Small, soft, the knuckles round and unworn, the fingernails short and clean in the way of a child's nails. No calluses. No old needle marks along the veins from years of drawing my own blood for routine testing. No scar on the left forearm from the containment breach in 2019. Not my hand, not even close to my hand. I set it down on the straw and took inventory. Body, child, approximately 7 years old. Based on limb proportion, no injuries, no illness, nutritional status adequate, slightly thin. Motor control developing but functional. Language. I reached for words and found them. Not my language. Something older, something that ran in different grooves, consonant heavy and flat voweled. I understood it completely. It sat in the muscles the way languages do when you've spoken them since birth. Memory. Both sets. My 48 years of epidemiology, fieldwork, graduate training, childhood in a city that no longer existed in this world. And behind that, fainter but accessible, a shorter life. A village, a father who was also the village's only healer, a mother who had died 2 winters ago of a fever, a name, Edric. My name in this body was Edric. I sat with that for a moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, an animal moved through wet straw, probably a goat or a pig. From the sound, quite close. From the smell, extremely close. I was 7 years old in approximately the year 1000. Give or take a century, I didn't yet have the context to narrow down. I was the son of the village healer of a settlement of perhaps 80 people, somewhere in what would one day be called northern France or the Rhineland, depending on which empire had most recently decided it owned the ground. The Black Death would arrive in Europe in 1347. If this was the year 1000, I had approximately 350 years before the largest pandemic in human history began killing 1 in 3 people on the continent. 350 years, assuming the timeline of this world matched the one I had studied. I looked at my small hands again in the firelight. I had worked with less favorable conditions. My father's name was Aldrich. Not the priest, though there was also a priest named Aldrich in the village, which caused a small amount of daily confusion that everyone had apparently accepted as the normal condition of life here. The healer was Aldrich the healer, and the priest was Aldrich the priest. And if someone said only Aldrich without qualification, you waited to see which one appeared. My father was a tall man, slightly stooped from a lifetime, of bending over patients who were always lying down. He had the hands of someone who worked with them constantly, large and precise, and a face that had settled into permanent mild concern, the way faces do when they spend decades receiving bad news. He was good at what he did for the year 1000. This was the problem. I spent the first 3 months watching him work. I was 7 years old and his son, and I was allowed everywhere. The patients didn't guard their condition from a child. My father didn't explain his reasoning to me because explaining his reasoning to a 7-year-old had not previously seemed necessary. I watched and I cataloged. For an infected wound, poultice of bread mold and honey. Roughly correct. The mold was penicillium. He didn't know what penicillium was, but 800 years of empirical observation had arrived at the right material through the wrong reasoning. For fever, willow bark tea. Correct. Salicylate compound, natural aspirin, reduced fever reliably. For chest congestion, steam from boiling herbs, specifically a local variety of thyme that contained thymol, a genuine antimicrobial. Also correct. For bleeding wounds, direct pressure, then cauterization if pressure didn't hold. Brutal but functionally sound. For childbirth complications, this is where it fell apart. He delivered babies with hands that had spent the morning touching a septic wound, then a dead animal, then the wooden table where he ate his meals. No washing between tasks. No concept of washing between tasks. The idea that invisible things on his hands could move from surface to patient was not a thought that existed in this world. In the first 3 months, I watched 2 women die of childbed fever. Both of them had been healthy before delivery. Both of them developed the fever within 48 hours of a difficult birth that required my father's direct intervention. I knew exactly what had killed them. The second woman had a daughter who survived. Her name was Mara. She was 3 weeks old when her mother died, and the miller's wife took her in because the miller's wife had milk to spare and a large heart and no capacity for watching a child go unfed. I visited the miller's house every day for the first week and watched Mara eat and sleep and grow, and did not think about the fact that her mother had been alive until my father's hands had introduced Streptococcus pyogenes into her bloodstream during a normal delivery. Then I stopped visiting and went back to watching my father work. I needed to understand the full picture before I moved. The problem with being 7 years old in possession of 22 years of epidemiological training is that the training is useless if no one listens to you. No one in this village was going to take medical instruction from a 7-year-old. Not from their healer's son, not from any child. Authority in this world traveled in one direction, downward, from God through the church, through the nobility, through the men, through the women, through the children, and children were at the bottom. I had 2 assets that I did not have when I had been an adult. The first was time. I was 7 years old. I had 350 years before the plague, and decades of my own life before I would be expected to take over my father's practice. There was no urgency in the short term. The second was invisibility. A child asking questions was not threatening. A child who followed his father everywhere was devoted. A child who listened carefully to every patient was simply unusually attentive. No one guarded their speech around me. I spent the remaining months of that year watching and learning the territory. The village was called Durnik, 83 people at last count, though one of the elderly men was clearly not going to survive the winter and the miller's wife was visibly pregnant again. The houses were clustered around a central well that served as the primary water source. The well drew from the same water table as the drainage ditch that ran along the eastern edge of the village where the pigs were kept. I looked at that relationship every day for a week. The well and the pig drainage were 40 meters apart. In a year with average rainfall, the drainage moved away from the well. In a year with heavy rainfall, the drainage moved toward it. In the last year, the summer had been wet. I went to the well and looked at the water, clear to the eye, tasteless, no obvious contaminants. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery are tasteless. I needed soap. The fat was the easy part. Rendered animal fat was produced constantly in this village. My father used it for poultices and ointments. The butcher had barrels of it. Getting access to fat required nothing more than asking. The ash was even easier. The hearth produced it every morning. The chemistry was simple enough that I had explained it to undergraduate students in 20 minutes. Saponification, the reaction between fat and an alkali solution that produced soap and glycerin. The alkali was lye, derived from wood ash dissolved in water. The fat and the lye combined under heat. The product was rough and harsh and smelled of wood smoke, but it was soap. I made the first batch on a Saturday afternoon in late autumn when my father was at the church for confession, and I had the house to myself. The process took 3 hours and produced a gray, waxy block the size of my fist. I washed my hands with it at the water basin. The water that ran off them was gray. I looked at the gray water in the basin. Then I looked at my hands, clean in a way that water alone never achieved in this climate, clean down to the nail beds. The gray in the water was what had been on my hands. I set the soap block on the shelf next to my father's herb bundles and waited for him to come home. He came home as the light was failing, stamping mud off his boots in the doorway, his breath visible in the cold air. He hung his cloak on the peg and moved toward the fire to warm his hands. He stopped when he saw the soap. He picked it up, turned it over, smelled it. What is this? A cleaner for hands. I made it from the rendered fat and the hearth ash. He turned it over again. The fat? The goat fat from the butcher's barrel. He said I could take some. I told him it was for you. My father looked at me with the expression he used when patients said things that required careful navigation. Where did you learn to make this? I had prepared this answer during the 6 hours before he came home. I said, I read it in the monastery at Weiss, one of the brothers who came through last spring. He left a written copy of some herb formulas. There was a page about cleaners. My father set the soap down. He went to the basin, picked up the soap block, lathered his hands. He looked at the water turning gray. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, use it before touching patients. That was all. No argument, no praise. One instruction. My father was an empiricist. He had not been trained in the theory of disease transmission. He had no framework for invisible pathogens. But he had spent 30 years watching outcomes. And a man who watches outcomes for 30 years develops instincts that theory can sometimes confirm but rarely improves. I had expected to argue. I had prepared the argument. I hadn't needed it. I made 4 more blocks of soap over the following week and gave one to the midwife. The midwife's name was Greta. She was 50 years old, thick-set, with a reputation for directness that the village interpreted either as confidence or rudeness, depending on who was doing the interpreting. She had delivered most of the current adult population of Dernick and considered herself the undisputed authority on birth in a 20-kilometer radius. She took the soap with the expression of a woman being handed an object whose purpose she was not yet willing to concede she didn't understand. I explained it the same way I had explained it to my father. I didn't mention invisible organisms. I didn't mention germ theory. I said, this removes the dirt that eyes can't see. Patients who are already weakened by birth should not also fight the dirt from our hands. Greta looked at the soap. She looked at me. I was 7 years old and I was the healer's son, and I had just given her a lecture on midwifery practice. She said, your father sent you with this? My father uses it now. I thought you might want it. A pause. She took the soap. 4 months later, Marta, the blacksmith's wife, delivered a healthy boy without fever and was on her feet 5 days afterward. 3 months after that, the carpenter's daughter delivered twins. Both survived. No fever. Greta came to our house one evening when my father was inside and I was sitting at the door. She stopped in front of me and looked at me for a moment. She did not say anything. She took a second block of soap from her apron and held it out. I need more of this. I made 6 blocks that week. The childbed fever rate in Dernick dropped to 0 over the following 2 years. My father noted this. He noted it the way he noted everything without ceremony, as an observed fact filed away under useful interventions. He did not ask me to explain further. He did not praise the result. He started using the soap between every patient. I was 9 when the priest noticed. His name, as I have said, was Aldrich. Aldrich the priest was not an unintelligent man. This was the complicating factor. An unintelligent man I could have managed. An intelligent man who was wrong about the foundations of his worldview was significantly more difficult, because intelligent men have better arguments. He came to our house in the 3rd year after the soap on an evening in March, and sat across the table from my father with a cup of the herbed wine my father kept for guests. He said there was talk in the village. My father said he was not surprised. There was always talk. Aldrich the priest said the talk was about the sun, about the soap and the low death rate, and the fact that Edric was seen at every bedside, and was seen always asking questions, and was seen reading things that no one had given him to read. He looked at me across the table. He said it gently. He was not threatening. He was concerned. He said, where does the boy learn these things? I was sitting in the corner with a piece of bark and a charred stick, doing exactly what he had said, reading. What I was reading was a list of patients and their symptoms that I had been compiling since I was 8. My father said, he learns from me. Aldrich the priest said, and you learned from your father and your father from his. None of them knew how to make the cleaner. None of them had a patient record on bark. This is something different. He was not wrong. I set the bark down and looked at them both. I said, I learned from watching. The cleaner I worked out myself from the ash and the fat. I have seen what happens when wounds are touched with dirty hands, and what happens when they aren't. I keep records because I cannot trust my memory. Aldrich the priest looked at me for a long moment. He was thinking about 2 things simultaneously. I could see it in his face. The first thing was, This child is unusual in a way that requires explanation. The second thing was, the explanations available to him in the year 1000 were limited, and some of them were dangerous for a child. He chose the safest one. He said, "I will pray for God's guidance in this matter." He left. My father looked at me after the door closed. He said, "Be less visible." I understood what he was saying. I was not going to stop. I was also not going to be obvious about not stopping. I started keeping the patient records inside a hollow in the wall behind the woodpile. I was 11 when I fixed the water. The connection between the pig drainage and the well had been in my mind since I was 7. I had been waiting for the right approach. Direct instruction had worked for the soap, because my father was already predisposed to pragmatic interventions, and the result was visible quickly. The water was harder. The contamination events were intermittent, dependent on rainfall patterns. In good years, nothing happened. In wet years, the well water carried whatever the pig drainage contained, and people got sick, and nobody connected the two things, because 4 weeks of wet weather had passed between cause and effect. I needed a wet year and a visible outbreak to prove the point. I didn't want to wait for one. Waiting for an outbreak to prove a point meant people died to prove a point. I found another way. There was a spring on the hillside above the village, 200 meters up the slope. I had found it in the second year while following my father on a house call to a shepherd's family that lived above the tree line. Clean water, cold, moving fast over limestone, no drainage anywhere near it for 500 meters in every direction. Clean water, beyond reasonable argument. I spent the summer of my 11th year clearing the path to the spring and building a channel. Not alone. Tomas, the blacksmith's son, was 13 and had the build of someone who had grown up around a forge, and also the temperament of someone who liked visible projects with clear completion points. I brought him to the spring in early April. I said, "If we bring this water down to the village, no one has to carry buckets." He looked at the spring, then down the slope at the village. He said, "Who you to think about water like that?" I said, "The slope does the work. I'm just pointing at it." He laughed. We built the channel in 8 weeks. Split timber lined with clay, descending the hillside in stages, ending at a stone basin. I had Thomas's father help me cut from a piece of flat rock near the smith.